There's a big difference between what they care about and what they think they're supposed to say that they care about.
Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories. Welcome back to So Here's My Story. I'm Jody.
I'm Elliot.
And just a couple quick things. If this episode is going to come out on March 3rd, which means that our beloved text the word story to 345-345
is no longer
works. And as of this moment, we don't have a new number yet. So don't do that. Do not text the word story to 345-345.
Everything's running according to plan.
So we'll keep you posted on that. But I honestly, the way that this podcast grows over and over and over again is when y'all who listen tell your friends about it. So please tell a friend about the show. We would love to expand our community. So,
yes, we would.
And let's get to the story.
Okay.
So here's my story. I got an email last week from a dear friend of mine, Jim Rafferty, and it said, "Thought of you" is the subject line. And then it said he was reading a book called First You Write a Sentence by Joe Moran, which I have not actually read. So I think it's a book on writing. I'm not sure. And he said there was a line in there that said, "Metaphor is how we nail the jelly of reality to the wall."
Nice.
Which I will say, first of all, when I first read it and several times thereafter, for some reason, when my mind hears that, I imagine a jellyfish, which is kind of gross. But
Nailing
anyway,
a jellyfish
yeah, I know
to the wall.
it's a little violent, but just the jelly of reality to the wall, and the amount that I love this is like ninefold. First of all, I use metaphor all the time, and so the fact that something about metaphor would make someone think of me as I love that. Secondly, I love that this is like a metaphor about metaphor.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Which I think makes it a meta metaphor, right? But anyway, but I love this because that is. There's a reason I love metaphor, not just because the way I love alliteration because it's fun to say or something.
You are all about alliteration.
Anytime I can, but metaphor to me feels so deeply important because it's in fact there was a time where we actually considered calling this podcast Metaphorically Speaking.
Yeah, we did.
And I do own that URL, by the way, metaphoricallyspeaking.com.
Oh, nice. Good.
Should we ever want to use it for anything. But I thought it was a great opportunity to, first of all, just love on this metaphor because I think there's so much goodness here, but also just why it is that metaphor is such a powerful thing and why it matters and what comes with it. And anyway, unless you're like, I don't think this is a good episode topic.
No. Actually, what I was thinking of is, and I actually way back, I wrote a blog post on this. It was talking about a Star Trek episode. I think
any opportunity we get to jump to Star Trek, we take it.
Yes, and I think this is the next generation Star Trek episode. But it was called Temba, His Arms Wide. And what the episode focused on was the fact that the crew had encountered a race of people whose language was solely metaphorically based. So in order to communicate with them, they had to understand the central sources, their Bible, if you will, so that when somebody would respond, Temba, his arms wide, it referred to a story in which the message of what they're trying to communicate was encompassed in that story.
Huh.
And so the real problem was that, well, the flip sides of the coin were, on the one hand, people within that community understood nuances to the communication that were well beyond what somebody hearing just a sentence in English would understand. But on the other hand, the metaphor was so deeply ingrained in the society and had so many nuances.
They're like private jokes.
Yes. So outside that community, you really couldn't communicate. It was very challenging to communicate.
Oh my gosh, I love this so much because there's so many different ways we can take this. I mean, imagine we end up talking about onboarding a lot for whatever reason, but just like if you have these metaphors or inside jokes or languaging, like all the different ways this can show up, like how does somebody get on board quickly enough. But even if we don't think about it like internally to your team or your organization, you have all sorts of meetings with clients and vendors and whatnot. And part of the reason I love facilitation, I often think of this quote that when I heard it originally, it's so much better than this. I've sought out this thing and I can't find it, but this was the gist of it. It was something about like the devil gave us language so that we could no longer understand one another.
Okay.
And the reason that is so powerful, and I again wish I had the original one because it was more eloquently said, but that really stuck with me because so often people feel like they understand each other, or they'll say we don't have good communication, and it has nothing to do with amount of communication. It's like this emotional thing where somebody is having an experience and they aren't expressing it well, but so often someone says a word and everyone thinks they know what they mean by that word. Like it has a meaning. And everyone then hears everything else that's said based on that perspective of how they imagine that word. And what's interesting is that can be so confusing because if I think of a good example, like if somebody says they value stability, or actually that's not even the right word that I want to use. There's a great example I use for this, and I can't remember what it is. Proceed while I find my thoughts again.
So the two things that occurred to me. One is I believe it's a quote from George Bernard Shaw. It's either George Bernard Shaw or Dick Van Patten. But
let's do an episode where we just do like we back quotes back and forth.
Yeah. So he said that the worst thing about communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Yes, exactly.
And it's interesting. I had this conversation, a conversation like this with my son Alex, because he's reading It by Stephen King.
Okay.
And he's really taken with the language and I've said before, I always read a chapter of Stephen King before talking to a jury only because he's such a good storyteller and it stops me from speaking like a lawyer and gets me in the mindset of actually telling a story.
I don't think you've ever mentioned that before. That's really cool.
I love the way he uses language. It doesn't even matter what paragraph. It's just, I like the rhythm of the words and how he paints a picture.
You want your brain thinking in that kind of like story rhythm. Yeah.
The passage, it was really just a phrase that Alex had pointed out was Stephen King was describing one of the main characters in It. And It follows a group of friends when they were 12 and then flashes forward to their adult lives and back to when they were 12. And there was this girl in the group, long red hair. But the way Stephen King described it was whore's hair. And he said that because now he fleshed out her character as being somebody who was constantly really sexually harassed by her and abused by her stepfather and by all these people. So in part, what Alex and I were talking about was he saying that to characterize her hair was improper? Or was he writing that because you could see that other people would just look at her and devalue her as a person and just see her as this whatever, just based on what her hair was? So was it written as the narrator explaining the nature of the hairstyle, or was it written to show the mindset of people looking at her and devaluing her as a person?
Right.
Just that one phrase could bring up so many different nuances.
2 words.
It's just 2 words.
2 words then can send your brain in, and my immediate thing was like, the sort of the judgment of it of like, well, there's no equivalent word for men for that sort of thing. You know what I mean? So your brain just goes in a completely different, can go in like 8 different ways. And that is the danger of language and why I so often try and I think I might have mentioned this before, but I use this not specifically for values exercises, but when I was going through my coaches training, there was this exercise they did to get at not just the way values are used in like mission, vision, values, but just in general, like what do you value as a human? No, statistically significant. Mission, vision, values. They would have you take all these words that you care about, like from a huge word bank or whatever. And you sort of start to capture words, or you tell stories, actually. That's how we did it in the exercise. You would tell stories about things you either love or hate or enjoyed or were meaningful. And the other person would listen and gather words that you used that start to tell a story of what you care about. But then this was the really powerful part. The second part of the exercise was to take those words and start to lump them together into, they call them value strings. So it'd be like word slash word slash word slash.
Value strings?
Strings, yeah, because you would string words, because words would get bucketed together.
Yeah.
Because when you bucket them together, then they have like a feeling to them. And then this last part of the exercise was to come up with a metaphor for that feeling that gets all those words. And the neat thing about it was it just inherently recognizes the fact that any one word is riskily non-communicating the thing.
So you're spreading the risk out among all of these different words and phrases. So eventually you'll hit, if one leans one way, one leans the other way, you hit the true meaning of what's important to you.
You hit the true meaning. And so, someone, the guy that I was working with, we were actually doing it. I was paired up with this guy, and he wanted to talk about his company, and as opposed to like a personal side, because he was working on that at the time. And so we talked about it, and he had this value string. I remember it had the word diversity in it, and it had, I don't know if you use the word inclusion. That's probably coming to mind now, just because those two things, this was 15 years ago.
Yeah.
It was diversity, and it was like differences, like different perspectives and things like that. And he actually struggled with that word diversity, because he was like, it's not just that I value having any one piece of it. You might assume that this is what we value. And at the end of the day, we kept working on it. And the metaphor that he came to was there's always room at the table.
Right.
Because to him, additional voices, whether it was from someone who grew up in another country or is of a different socioeconomic background or racial background or gender, or just grew up in a family that was like super differently put together, whatever it was, he didn't really care as much about necessarily why the perspective was different, but they just deeply valued that there's always room at the table for another perspective to weigh in about something they hadn't thought about before. But that's a lot to say. So to be able to say, like, we have a value of there's always room at the table, then that's something you can decide by or use to make decisions.
Yeah. And, when you said diversity, the thing that strikes me is, especially when you were saying that this person is talking about his business, I think the value of the string is the fact that when I hear somebody say diversity in business, it's like quality or
excellence.
Family excellence or whatever. It's like, well, is that a word that you're using because you're supposed to? Because you feel that you're supposed to? Or is that actually one of your values? Because there's a big difference. And we've talked about this before, when I help companies put together personnel manuals, there's a big difference between what they care about and what they think they're supposed to say that they care about.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So you even have these boilerplate paragraphs on diversity and inclusion and equal opportunity and all that stuff that you can cut and paste from one personnel manual to another. And I'm sorry, but that's the way a lot of people do it.
Yep.
And it's not even that nobody reads it. Nobody even really writes it anymore. It's just that word. So what does that word actually mean? Does it have a meaning at all? And that's why I like the exercise of the value string or whatever you call it. Is that right?
Yeah, value string.
Because you kind of account for those kind of inclusions that are just throwaways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There is, and this is not the right word. This is going to bug me forever. There's a word that I use to kind of hash this out sometimes and this isn't quite the right word, but it's this umbrella word that can then, I remember the things it breaks down into, but let's just say it's security. It has something to do with feeling, whatever the umbrella word that can kind of shatter into all these very, very, very different things, has to do with like feeling safe about the future. So we'll just call it security right now. And say I'm talking to someone and they say, security is really important to me, or dependability or whatever. Well, what I have found, and the reason I love to break these things down, and the reason metaphor is so important, because it gets to the feeling of a thing in a way that's actionable, is sometimes what somebody means by that is something in the financial realm, but even that breaks down more. So like there's a difference between financial stability and financial independence. Right? Like those
Absolutely.
are like if the exact itch that somebody is wanting to scratch is financial stability, then they value the like paycheck piece of it. They don't want to wonder where the next thing is. Whereas financial independence might actually require like a bigger, bolder move so that you have a big thing and then you don't have to worry about it later.
Right. So if the source of that paycheck goes away, you're still okay.
You're still okay, which they ultimately both get to sort of the same place, but where somebody's talking about what they're longing for in the moment versus I've had people use a word, and again, it's going to bug me. Stability wasn't the right one, but whatever my own example was that I can't remember. I have had people use that word when what they actually mean is flexibility. Having nothing to do with finances at all, because what they value is having options, and when they don't have options, they don't feel safe. They feel like if they're someone who gets angsty when they worry, they might get painted into a corner.
Right.
So safety, stability. I think maybe stability's anyway. Whatever, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter, Jody. Let it go.
Oh, you won't let it go.
I won't let it go.
Long after this episode,
you just keep talking.
Stop.
No, it's going to bug me. And in fact, when I remember what it is, I'm going to text you, and then I'm going to mention it. Be like, here's that word, and then I'll have Tom go back and insert it in all these places.
That'll be challenging. Go Tom.
Yeah, go Tom. No, but you can see just on that example, whatever my initial word was, if somebody just says that word in a meeting, and one person at the table thinks they mean financial stability, and somebody else thinks they mean financial independence, and someone else thinks they mean flexibility, we are now living on 3 separate islands, actually 4, because the person might mean something completely different, trying to have a conversation and make decisions. And that is insane. I mean, how do we get, and we might make a decision and still completely misunderstand each other. Whereas if you have when you use metaphor, it's for whatever reason, I think it takes people out to the fuzzy focus of a thing where they don't get stuck on the wordsmithing, but it's much more precise.
No, and that's why, and you mentioned this at the beginning, at the outset of the episode, you touched on the importance in onboarding and in speaking that common language. And because it's the stories around which you've built your values. Or the stories, I should say, the stories that embody your values are far more important in many respects than the words that define your values. Mm-hmm. And I do find that very few, at least what I've been able to see in my line of work, very few organizations are fluent in the language of story. They are simply fluent in the language of statute. Of what you're supposed to say, of what sounds good, of what won't get us in trouble, and they don't take the time to speak about or to really have their stories coalesce into something that is meaningful to the entire group, not just to the e-board and not just to the CEO. But meaningful to the entire group because there's a shared experience. And I don't see that very often.
Yeah. And I think, and I wonder why that is. I mean, because all companies, it's not like they have a lack of stories.
No, but I think that there's an absence of prioritization because you know that you have to get your personnel manual out. You know that you have to have these policy memos and you know that you have to have these letters from the CEO or whatever. But and you even know that you have to market, but a lot of marketing is so outside focused and there's very little inside focused to make sure that all of these values are demonstrated in what we do and how we do it and the stories that we can tell and that the people inside feel a part of that story. Mm-hmm. I just don't see that there's a lot of effort that goes into marketing internally so that we speak our own language.
So you just made me think of something important. I think stories are where the metaphors can be drawn from, but I think metaphor trumps story even one more level because the stories can, in theory, have the same risk that words have. They can sound very precise. Like, here's what you do if you're in this exact same situation that Bob was in.
Right.
And it won't always be like that. But from the stories is where you can draw these, I I think of it as like fuzzy focus. I don't know what those things are called, but those things that you look at, and they're like a gobbledygook of things. But if you relax your vision, you can suddenly start to see the
posters from the 90s or,
yes,
or 80s or whatever
okay,
it was.
Yes, posters from the 90s. We'll just call it that. That kind of thing where when you relax your vision, you can see the thing versus if you're looking too granularly, you see all the pieces. And I think with metaphor, the reason I love it is it gets at a widely applicable construct that you can use to define and navigate things that isn't too. It takes it out of the tic tab be stick in slot A. It's like here's the intent behind a thing that you can apply across the board. I mean, there's always room at the table. That doesn't just apply to like big leadership conversations. That applies to you can probably put that. You can apply that in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, you can. And you're right, because a whole story might make somebody think that it's an instruction manual, whereas nobody is actually physically going to try to nail jelly to a wall. I mean, so you have to think in the abstract, what does this stand for, and how do I apply this theory? And it doesn't even have to be, sometimes it's metaphor, which I really like. Sometimes it's just a sentence that everybody in the organization knows what you mean. I mean, so for example, I've said this before, we don't want to be anybody's first lawyer. And that yes. encompasses, it's not really metaphor,
not
so to
quite,
speak.
But for the purposes of what I'm talking about, it works.
Yeah,
because it tells a story beyond, there is a literal aspect to that, but the intent is actually the metaphorical or, the whatever.
Right. It stands for something larger than the meaning of the individual words. The sum is greater than the parts.
Yes.
And for us, there's a story in, well, can we serve that particular client? What are the needs of that particular client? How are we built? And all of that is boiled down to it. Yeah, this is not what we do well. And we can say it in a sentence, and everybody knows the larger ramifications of violating this concept.
Mm-hmm. I do want to go back to this original metaphor because I think there's more juice there, to use a metaphor to talk about a metaphor that talks about a metaphor.
Meta-metaphor.
Meta-metaphor. This jelly, nailing jelly to a wall, that's impossible. You can't nail jelly to a wall, right? Which I think is some of the beauty of this metaphor. Is like metaphor is how we do accomplish an impossible task, which is you can't nail the jelly of reality to a wall. And yet reality is this fluid like jelly thing that can't be nailed down. So it's like metaphor is how we get as close as we possibly can to aligning our reality so that we can actually function and be as aligned as possible. It's as close as we can get to that kind of alignment, I think.
No, I agree. I think it's in a way what keeps occurring to me is the line that democracy is the worst system of government in the world except for all the others. Sometimes I think that was Churchill, by the way.
Gotcha.
So, but sometimes I think that when your choices are words and documents and paragraphs and all that stuff, that metaphor, while it can't claim to be exact, is so much better than the other alternatives because it gives you your best shot at alignment. Yes.
Yeah. And so what's interesting, especially to this, and this could be a whole other, I won't go down these rabbit holes, but there's been a whole series of things zooming around social media lately about all the different ways, comparative things to how we hear, see, taste, whatever. There was a thing about not everyone has an inner monologue or inner dialogue, like they can't
right, which
hear.
Still mystifies me, by the way.
I know. And the same is true. I was talking to my daughter about this. Like if you close your eyes and I say, imagine a red star, some people literally see a red star like right in front of them visually. Some people see absolutely nothing, not even, and mine's kind of in between. If you ask me to see something, or you say like, imagine a little girl walking down a path and she has a dog. I see it, but I don't, and this is hard to distinguish, I don't see it literally right in front of me like I'm watching a movie. I see it, making air quotes, the way I have a memory, which feels distinct to me, and maybe that's splitting hairs, but that feels slightly different. Whereas my daughter doesn't either one. She doesn't see when you speak verbally, which I think is fascinating because I'm like, how do you remember things if you don't, like, I don't even know how that works. But her brain works, all of our brains work so differently. And I suspect that we see things differently. We hear things differently. I know we taste things differently. My son thinks that broccoli is sweet. Like, I love broccoli, but it ain't sweet. Like, that's just bizarre. So, and our senses are how we compare the world. So there is something about this metaphor that makes it distinct from words, from even our other senses, that all try to create precision and I think often end up missing the mark. Whereas metaphor can put kind of a dotted line around all those sensations and experiences of a thing and say, do you feel the intent of this space? And so if we can all get aligned on just the intent behind a thing, I think it means we don't have to be as precise about the pieces.
So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts.
Your stories.
Your stories.
You can find links to that group as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village.
Yes, it does.
We'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best
Lovingly
of ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us.
Which
is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.